Well, good afternoon, NABC members and community. My name is Angel Moss Baker. I am the lead for the NABC Advocacy and Legislative Branch. And today we are holding this forum to discuss the importance of voter registration. We are recognizing Voter Registration Day as a day that the day for folks that are not registered to register and to ask that you check on your registration. We're going to talk about why this is important, and especially during the climate in which we are now living in. And it's just important for us to get out and vote. So our title of our forum today is, as I mentioned, in recognition of National Voter Registration Day, and we're entitling this one "Cultivating Political Optimism." Um, it, we have a delightful lady that is going to present for us today, and I want to introduce you to Megan Sun. Megan is the Senior Director of Government Affairs for ICE Miller's Government Affairs and Regulatory Law Group. She leads public policy strategies for corporations and mission-driven clients across several sectors, including telecommunications, sports and entertainment, financial services, transportation, and emerging technology at every level of government. Megan represents clients before Congress and federal agencies, including the Federal Communications Commission, National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and Department of Commerce, crafting legislative and regulatory strategies that align with both business priorities and public interest outcomes. At ICE Miller, Megan serves as a strategic advisor to city governments and utilities, helping them navigate federal funding opportunities and regulatory hurdles. She plays a key role in guiding public-private partnerships, to expand digital infrastructure in cities around the country. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Megan. And we do have at the end a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, wants to engage in any discussion, Megan will open the floor for that. All right. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Megan.
Good afternoon, everyone. So happy to be here and to be speaking with you all. Definitely appreciate the work that you all do at NABC. As Angel mentioned, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction. My work really cuts across many different levels of government, and I also represent varying organizations, but I do focus a lot on working with groups like yours to figure out ways to activate your membership and also share strategies and education on a lot of the civic engagement issues I think that we're facing, particularly at the time that we find ourselves in now. And that's why the National Voter Registration Day is so important, and also cultivating political optimism. I think that no matter where you sort of fall on the political spectrum, there has been a rising level of apathy towards the government, certain levels of distrust, and a lot of misinformation I think that's out there that has been preventing people from voting. So we'll spend this time this afternoon just talking a little bit about the state that we find ourselves in and ways that we can cultivate that optimism that gets people to the polls. Okay. So voter registration in the Black community, I think that, it's been well documented and we all sort of understand the historical context of voting rights and Black communities. That's why this particular forum is so important, especially because of the work that you all do to touch people in the community and the trust that they find with you. So there's a few things that we'll go over. Obviously, voter registration in the Black community, will go over a graphical analysis of Black voter trends in Black voter participation, recent trends in voter registration among Black voters, and then also obviously the historical context, as I mentioned. So this first graphic we're looking at is just kind of looking at the voter turnout trends over the years. I think if we can go back, if you look back to 2016 and before 2020, you see a little bit of an elevated level of activity. But then as we're looking at the last election and as we're coming into now the midterms coming up in 2026, there has been a sort of decrease in voter registration and interest in voting across the spectrum. But in particular, if you look at the Black community, there is a more significant dip. Let's think about why this is happening. I had the privilege of attending a presentation with the Congressional Black Caucus Political Action Committee, and they had a presentation talking a little bit about the reasons that folks aren't voting. As I mentioned before, the number one reason that we're seeing folks are just not interested. I think, the lack of interest really resonates with folks when we think about the last election and what came out sort of in the postmortem was that candidates are not focusing on the issues that are impacting people in their everyday lives, what we call kitchen table issues. So people aren't interested. They're not seeing the real change happening in their lives. They don't understand why their votes matter. They don't understand, at a local level, how much those elections matter. We'll get into some of that later as well. There's also the fact that people are too busy. There are a lot of conflicting things and priorities that affect people, right? Like, especially with the cost of things going up, a lot of folks are focusing on trying to make ends meet, focusing on, having one, two, and even three jobs, side hustles, managing very busy schedules. And I think even for folks, who have what we call, more professional jobs or who are working more in the service industry and probably some members of your community, I think that the fact that we are moving into more of a digital world where people are more connected all the time. There's not a time where you really shut down and close your door at 5 p.m. But there are a lot of competing interests and a lot of things pulling people away from thinking about voting. Another one that I'll talk about really quickly is not liking the candidates or the campaign issues. I think in the biparty system that we have currently, where we have the Democrats and Republicans, I think the polarization between those two parties are finding us at a place where people aren't seeing themselves in either party, and there's a level of apathy there. And I'd love, as we get into the question and answers discussion, just to hear more about what you all are hearing in the field when you're talking to folks as well. Obviously, there's other reasons like illness or disability, being out of town, forgetting to vote. But I think by and large, what we're hearing from political experts and strategists is really, once again, like not being interested because of not really seeing a change in everyday lives, and then also the polarization of politics and the state that we find ourselves in. Presidential elections have higher turnout than midterms. As I mentioned, we have midterm elections coming up in 2026. We'll talk a little bit also about off-year elections. There's a number that are coming up this year as well, and we'll give a sort of a brief on that. But as I mentioned before, there is a lot of energy that comes into presidential elections around the country, but if we're really looking at what's going to really impact folks in their everyday lives, it's really those state and local elections. There are a lot of, for example, majority Black cities that are blue cities in red states. There are a lot of local elected officials that impact everyday life in terms of health administrators and chief of police. So it's really important that we encourage each other to really look at some of those elections, because as you can see, it's pretty consistent that there are higher turnout during presidential elections, but we need to really raise that to more parity. Okay. As I mentioned, off-year elections matter. There are a number of special elections and off-year elections that regularly happen outside of the midterms and also outside of the presidential elections. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the elections that are happening this year. And for many of these elections, there's still an opportunity to learn about candidates and get involved and also push people to the polls for those elections. So voter turnout and off-year elections often influences political power nationally. As I mentioned before, there are dynamics at play when you think about the amount of red states versus blue states. Also thinking, once again, as I mentioned, there are many majority blue cities, but majority Black populations that are in red states. And also when you think about what happened in Texas and we think about redistricting, all of that happens at the state level. So turning attention to off-year elections is critical. There's also more opportunity for engagement in off-year elections that strengthen democratic participation year-round. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of energy that happens during Q2 and Q3 of a presidential election year, but a lot of the work that needs to be done on the ground floor needs to be happening now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about 2025 off-year election states. Off-year elections include gubernatorial, legislative, and local contests based on the state's election cycle. For example, and we'll talk a little bit about it, there's a gubernatorial election coming up for the state of Virginia, which is a very large state. 5 states hold off-year elections. 4 of those also hold off-year state legislative elections. Kentucky, for example, elects executive offices. Louisiana, executive and legislative offices. Mississippi, executive and legislative offices. New Jersey, executive and legislative offices, and also Virginia. Here is a broader graph of the elections that are coming up. A number of them are even coming up as soon as this week. For example, in Iowa, Montana, and North Carolina, a lot of those local primaries are happening in North Carolina coming up, as well as in Ohio. I also note there's some local elections happening in Florida and Georgia, and also South Carolina. Once again, thinking about the representation of the members of NABC and the clients you all care for. A lot of these states that are participating in off-year elections are in the South and are in places where there are blue cities in red states. Let's talk a little bit about the Virginia candidates. For some of the other clients that I work with, they have been paying a lot of attention to this particular election. We have Abigail Spanberger and also Winsome Earl Sears. Winsome Earl Sears is the current lieutenant governor of Virginia, and Abigail Spanberger is a former congresswoman representing some of the rural areas in the northern and central part of Virginia. We'll talk a little bit more about the state of the race, but by and large, Winsome Earl Sears, she is a Republican. She is a part of the Youngkin administration. It's important to know that in many ways, the lieutenant governor position is very limited in terms of the policies that they do influence, but she is someone that is known statewide, running on the ticket with Youngkin in Virginia. Abigail Spanberger is a former intelligence officer. She has a good track record when it comes to some of the issues that you all care about in terms of healthcare and protecting Social Security. But by and large, when it comes to some of the issues that affect the Black community in particular, I think there is some more work that can be done, especially with members of NABC, in terms of raising your issues to the campaign and ensuring that, if when she's elected, that she's paying attention to those issues for you and for the communities that you serve. So, as I mentioned before, there is a sort of a clear sort of leader in this election. Abigail Spanberger, by and large, is leading the lieutenant governor at this point. There is a lot happening on the Republican side, on the national side, in terms of this particular election, in terms of not a lot of enthusiasm in terms of the amount that she's being able to raise. And also what we're hearing is a bit of a chaotic campaign. So with that being said, as I mentioned before, there is Abigail Spanberger is a clear leader, but there's still time to influence her policy agenda and focus on this particular election that's happening this year. Okay, so getting to the most important part. So we learned a little bit about what's happening nationally, the lack of participation in voting, talked a little bit about the different elections that folks can get involved in. But let's talk a little bit about cultivating the political optimism and changing the tide. So, cultivating political optimism refers to the intentional effort to foster hope, positivity, and confidence in the political process to solve public issues. This means promoting hope and confidence in the potential positive change through collective democratic action. Engaging advocacy, especially among young counselors, practitioners, and educators, strengthens communities and inspires others to participate in the political process. So, as I mentioned before, when we think about the Black community and our engagement in voting, it's very important to focus on some of the demographics within our community that have shown that they have less interest in voting. I think in particular, if we look at the last presidential election, there was a lot of talk about young Black men and their lack of interest in political campaigns. I will also say, one, being a Black woman, but also being a Black professional in the political space, there is a lot of feeling of, just feeling tired of, Black women coming to sort of save the day every time for the Democratic Party. And just, there are a lot of folks that didn't have a lot of optimism, even folks that spent a lot of time on the campaign and worked very closely on these issues. So that's where I think that members and NABC can be very active in cultivating that optimism. One, you are in the communities and you are people in the community that people trust, and you have the information and tools to educate folks and kind of also understand from a social and emotional standpoint how they can be motivated and how to cultivate some of that optimism. I think also in this time, there is sort of a new guard, or there are changes in terms of, traditional civil rights groups and their impact on communities. I think that a lot of the leadership in groups like the NAACP and National Urban League, they're aging. So I think that there is a lot of room for new advocates and younger advocates to come into the main stage and to influence some of that optimism and energy to bring people to the voting booth. Let's talk a little bit about the consequences of political pessimism, decreased turnout, erosion of trust, and impact of policy. I don't think that there has been a time in our recent history where this has been more clear. I think that a lot of people are seeing that there are a lot of things that are that's happening at the federal level and even at the state and local level that is not in line with their interests or their political point of view. Voter apathy, as I mentioned before, I know I've said this time and time again, political pessimism often results in decreased turnout. We did not see a lot of folks show up during the last presidential election, and that's because many people feel like their votes don't matter. But I think what we're seeing today, and what I hope that we can sort of instill in folks in our community, is understanding what happens if we don't vote. I think that sometimes, because of the way that the government works, in particularly the checks and balances and some of what happens, particularly when there are very small margins in Congress, many people feel like their votes or the policy is not happening fast enough. But we're quickly seeing what happens if we don't vote, if we don't use our voices, and how quickly things can go the other direction. There is also folks who use this time for a protest vote, a vote to demonstrate dissatisfaction with the choice of candidates. Folks writing in other candidates that didn't have a chance at all to be elected. Folks who voted in the other direction because they are dissatisfied, or they're not happy with the Democratic Party, for example. And that leads to also the discussion around trust deterioration. I think when we think about what I mentioned before with lack of progress and not that quick move to progressive change. Community members lose faith in the electoral system and collective trust diminishes, and that weakens the bonds necessary for effective community action and advocacy. So as I mentioned before, when we're dealing with very slim margins and the increased polarization that we're seeing, particularly in America at this current moment, there's a lot of deterioration of trust in government at all, and that definitely breeds lack of engagement and voting. Let's talk a little bit about the policy implications. Lack of engagement can lead to policies that neglect specific needs and concerns of Black communities, resulting in disconnect between elected officials and their constituents. We are effectively seeing the dismantling of the Department of Education. In particular, in this last tax bill that came out, there was a significant cut to plus loans. As we know, many Black professionals like myself and many others depend on these loans in order to seek graduate education in particular. And because of the lack of voter engagement, that's how these policies are quickly unraveling, and it's going to take a lot of time for some of this funding to come back. So hopefully, unfortunately, we're finding ourselves in this position, but hopefully that can seed some of the energy we need to get people back to the polls. So, just to recap, consequences of political pessimism, I think we're seeing it in real time in cities and states all around the country. What has happened in a very short time. As a reminder, we are not even a year into this 4-year term, and but working with, in particular, with the cities I work with, trying to figure out even how to manage everyday needs of their constituents is difficult, not only because of policies that do not align or funding that is being cut for necessary elements of the government, of their local government, but also just the uncertainty. The way that this government or this administration has been handling making changes and closing funding, it's been very, very difficult to even operate at the local level. So once again, voter apathy, protest voting, trust deterioration, lacking of engagement, we're seeing that in real time. But looking at the silver lining, hopefully this time that we're in, particularly in such a quick, to have this happening so quickly, will increase engagement in the midterms and hopefully for the presidential election for next term. Okay, so let's talk about how we fix the issue, addressing political pessimism. Let's talk about collective action. Community-based initiatives designed to boost voter engagement, education engagement can alleviate feelings of cynicism and empower others to believe in the transformative power and potential of their vote. Also, collective mobilization. This promotes and nurtures the spirit of collective action. Communities can build momentum for change, emphasizing the strength that comes from unified voices advocating for their rights and needs. When I was very early in law school, during my first year, I worked directly with the Florida NAACP, and we worked on voter engagement and voter protection efforts in Florida. And Florida can be extremely tough politically for the Black community. And what I was hearing from people when I was working in those communities and working on those initiatives is just honestly a basic level misunderstanding about how the government works and how just basic civil education. I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of community-based initiatives, bringing together different groups that have interests and have trust in communities to educate, particularly the newer generation, and using tools that finding them where they are, even using social media to create content to help them understand why their vote matters. Collective mobilization, as I mentioned before, I've worked both with local governments, I've worked with candidates, I've worked with civil rights groups, and one of the best things I'm finding is we are best when we work together and find different ways to work across the public and private sector to bring people to the table and find them where they are. I think really understanding how to speak to different groups and different generations, frankly, and speaking their language is important. In particular, I saw a lot of campaigns and am seeing a lot of campaigns that have been coming out utilizing social media in a way that's effectively been able to really activate a new generation of political candidates and also advocates. In the Democratic Party in particular, we're seeing a lot of younger candidates coming in and even challenging incumbents that have long been seated because of some of this engagement. So I think when we talk about community-based initiatives and collective mobilization, it's fine-tuning the message that NABC wants to bring to the table and how to partner with others who are working in the field. Empowerment. This is important because you know, from where I sit and the work that I do, we work a lot sort of on the technical side of bringing together campaigns and working with governments and doing some of that technical aspect of it. But a lot of this in terms of voter engagement really should focus on making people feel empowered and understanding that their votes matter. Not only that, but also making sure that they're prepared. So, number one is ensuring everyone is prepared ahead of the election. That means registered to vote, informed when to vote, and who to vote for. There are a number of text and, as I mentioned before, social media campaigns that I've been seeing going out that have been extremely effective. But it's also understanding that things happen like the voter rolls being purged, making sure that even though you have been registered, that you're checking your registration every time, and that you're well informed and engaged on who to vote for and where and when. Educational outreach. Developing and distributing pamphlets, guides, and hosting workshops to educate your community to quell cynicism to voter engagement. And that's in any space you find yourself in. I think that people think that you have to necessarily bring people to the table or have a voting event just about voting. Sometimes it's sort of finding people where you are in your community, whether that's your sorority or fraternity. That might be a parent group. That might be a neighborhood group. Of moms and dads, or dinners that you're having with friends to bring some of that information to the table, so that people can have a safe space to have those honest conversations. Last is, community mobilization, building a collective community spirit and reducing barriers to voter engagement and participation. Target younger demographics and encouraging their participation in the electoral process. So as I mentioned before, I've worked with newer advocacy groups. I've worked with some of the traditional groups like NAACP. I think that, in particular in the Black community, we are seeing that there is sort of a difference in the way that some of the older groups communicate as it compares to some of the younger groups. And I think that there are opportunities to build a bridge, because we need to work together in order to really build more mobilization and bringing more people to the polls at every generation. Okay, so I'll leave you with this. When we vote, we significantly impact policy initiatives and resources that directly affect the well-being of Black communities, such as health, education, and security. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Okay. So we have worked through the presentation. I would love to engage in more of a discussion, would love to answer any questions, take any comments, and just thank you all so much for your time and allowing for me to share this presentation.
Megan, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. So the floor is open. If there are any questions, comments. One of the things, oh, go ahead. Thank you.
I was going to say, go ahead, Angel. You can go.
One of the things I wanted to ask you to do, and this is for anyone who sees this and they want the slides, and we can forward the slides to them, that there's some links here. The one with the dates of when each state has their off-year elections. If we could kind of show folks how they can, based on where they live, if we clicked on Virginia or North Carolina, that link will open up, I believe.
I think that it will open up, but I think because we're on the Zoom, it will only open this window. But happy to share these links so that we can have folks uh, take a look at the best ways to get connected to these elections. And I'm also happy to share some additional resources, sort of putting this all on one page with some links that people can use.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah,
Absolutely.
because it takes you to where you vote, how to register to vote. There's a lot of information about the candidates that you can read up increase your awareness about these candidates and who you would want to vote for. Um, Go ahead, Nick. You had a question or comment?
Well, first off, I do want to thank Megan for sharing this information with us. I want to say that NABC has engaged her firm to work with us on advocacy, which is something different than what a lot of the other associations are doing. We're actively trying to educate our folks and advocate on behalf of our folks. We're not just giving out CEs. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. And the other thing is, Megan, you talked about, folks voting for other party candidates. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I think that this is the time though, if you're going to do that, you do it now. Like those people need to be established before we get to the national elections. So
Absolutely.
how would one go about finding out information about those candidates? Because they're not from one of the two major parties, and maybe those candidates more align with the issues that are important to our members.
Absolutely. I do think there is sort of a lack of lead up for some of these other party candidates, and that it to the general public, I feel like they don't really show up to folks because the national news media doesn't really pick them up until they've actually registered for the presidential. A lot of times they don't get to enough in the way of funding or fundraising in order to make it into the to debates and the campaigns. But there are some resources that I'm happy to share in terms of looking at some of the historical groups that have basically entered elections. For example, like the Green Party, the Libertarians. There's some other groups that are sort of emerging, and ways that you all can follow and learn more about those candidates before we get to the presidential. Because I do think it's important, especially when we're in a space where there is a very high erosion of confidence in our bi-party system, for people to fully understand what these other candidates about before we get to the end of the election and they really don't feel like they have a choice or their voice is being heard. So that's what I will say. I think that, a lot of times when folks don't hear about them, it's just really honestly by the nature of the system, the lack of engagement that those parties get on news media, and also their inability to join the debate stage. But as I mentioned before, and with the sort of unique moment we are in history, combined with the emerging technology and ways that people are able to communicate and create audiences from their homes using various platforms from podcasts to YouTube and things like that, I would imagine that there may be some more engagement in particular for this next election. But I do also agree that folks should learn more about those candidates to feel more engaged and for us to increase engagement in future elections.
Thank you. And another issue that we have is getting younger folks energized about elections and and candidates. What are any insights that you all can offer on that?
Absolutely. I think that it's really understanding what their issues are. I think that every generation kind of goes through it. I'm a millennial, but I remember the generation before me sort of, not really understanding, how millennials work and how they show up, for example, in the workplace. I think similarly as a millennial, we're looking at Gen Z, like, and we don't understand, how they show up and what those issues are. But in order to effectively engage with the newer generation, which I think is Gen Z and now also Gen Alpha, it's going to be important for people to really engage with them and understand. In particularly, I think that social media, once again, is a great way to sort of understand what they're thinking about in order to understand what their policy agenda is and speak to those interests. Zoran Moldani over in New York City that's running for mayor did a fantastic job of that. I know I've spoken to both professionals and then also just having general conversations with folks in Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And what I will say is that he found a way to use social media to connect with those communities, learn to speak to the issues they care about, like, student loan debt and their inability to prospectively purchase a home when they're ready to, and present it in a way where he was taken serious, but he used the tools and found the streams of influence that they were paying attention to. So he used a lot of social media and he created a short video, but he spoke very clearly about what his agenda was. So I think I think if we're looking to a way to engage the younger community, his campaign in particular, in terms of what folks are analyzing and trying to figure out how to replicate, is a great example.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Oh, Dr. Christian has a question.
Hi, Megan. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I am an elder millennial, and so Gen Z is different. And I think the way in which they communicate. But so when you said that, I also think about the fact that the counseling profession is similar to that because we have these just professional restrictions, right? So in my counseling space, unless my client is talking about politics, it doesn't necessarily show up in this space, although arguably, our code of ethics kind of lends itself to one political party more than the other. And so my clients, I think by default, kind of know where I stand with a lot of work that I do. But I'm wondering for the overall body, for the membership, um, it what do you feel like is coming up on the horizon that maybe we should be prepared for or think about? Because I think about for counselors, we're holding space for everybody, but we don't necessarily think about us, right? And so, like, take Gen Z has their way now of like how they show up, how they advocate. I think as millennials, we have our way. I think Gen X, etc. But for counselors who encompass all of the generations, what do you think is coming up on the horizon for us? And then how do we um, communicate our messaging without being too political?
Absolutely. I definitely understand that line, right? Being an attorney and having certain restrictions, but also, working in advocacy and then separately just sort of being someone who's like a leader in like my personal community, like my family, friends, and like where I live and work. There's a line that we have to walk as professionals to make sure that we are, being ethical, particularly when we're working with our clients. One, I would say, I kind of talked to a few things. One, in terms of sort of walking that line, I feel like there are ways to show up in each of those spaces that are quote unquote safe in terms of ethics. I think when we were talking about advocacy, joining a group and being active in a group like NABC is an excellent way to do that. And that's why these associations exist, is to create a space and cover where you all can advocate and create that collective mobilization in a space where it's not just Dr. Atasha talking, and you're not going to see any sort of personal reprisal for some of your personal thoughts and your personal influences and thoughts. This is a way where we could pull together a collective agenda that you all can share as an organization and bring to candidates, and use to, for example, hold candidates to the feet to the fire, or even endorse candidates away in ways to influence their agendas by using the organization as an instrument. So I do think that NABC and the work that we will be doing together is a way to do that. But when we're thinking about what's coming up on the horizon, I think if I were sitting in your shoes, and as I'm thinking of ways that we will work together, and as we build out your policy agenda, I think one of the things that stand out to me the most, and what I'm talking to elected officials and some of the other groups that I work with as well, in particularly is the militarization of the police that is happening and that is being targeted in Black cities right now. There is a lot of concern about the fact that, for example, I live in Washington, D.C. We do have soldiers present. There is, for example, a very increased amount of police present. And I think in particular for NABC, before we got to this point, and what we had been working on the Democratic side is thinking about ways to make sure that people who are suffering from mental illness are not being policed in a way, or being overly policed because of their mental illness, and also thinking about alternatives and different ways to engage with folks who may be experiencing a mental health crisis that are not being policed. Obviously, if you're bringing a lot of police or over policing an area, or over policing several cities, and you're focusing on cities where there are majority Black community, that's going to be an issue, I think, for not only the clients in the NABC, but as you are working to try to influence the issues that are important to those communities and uplift those communities, it's going to be a huge issue, I think, for your members. So I think that's a point of focus that we can look at is, if we're really talking about crime, and we're actually talking about crime, and we're trying to reduce crime, the space that NABC can step in to be a part of that, and also advocate for alternatives to policing for folks who are dealing with mental health issues.
That's really helpful. I just, as you were saying that, I was thinking, and I'll send it, I think for when there's conversation about how we sort of send that messaging out, I'm almost thinking about um, kind of as an organization, unfortunately, kind of returning back to what to do if stopped by police and individuals who have severe mental illness, who oftentimes present more physical and
Yes.
posturing than maybe someone else would not. And I have been in DC recently, and it is very odd to see. Like, and I lived in Southeast, and I am like,
Yeah.
I felt less safe in Northwest last week than I ever did living in Southeast. And just because for me, I said I'm not used to seeing that. And so I think about a person with severe mental illness, chronic mental illness, transient. That's a good point of what those exchanges might look like. And so I think that is really good messaging that we could send. So that's very helpful. Thank you for that.
Absolutely no problem at all. And I think, to that point, in parallel, there's also a targeting of the unhoused. And I know that in that particular community, there is an over indexing of folks dealing with mental health crisis, like as you mentioned, transient, and they're also being targeted and aren't really given tools in terms of knowing how to engage when, a member of the National Guard, or in some cases, and I know that Mayor Bowser has mentioned, definitely pushing back on this. Police officers with no sort of identification, you don't even know which unit they're from with masks on, and you're not really knowing how to engage. And if you're someone who's experiencing mental illness, or dealing with those kind of issues, that could be extremely traumatic. And I think it honestly is traumatic for everyone. I think, even with me living in Washington, D.C., I come out of Union Station, and seeing 16 police officers addressing after school altercation, things that we, normal children do, right? People, they have disagreements, and kind of seeing that, like, that's difficult, I think, for a lot of people to sort of wrap their head around. I know in some other groups that we've been dealing with, they've been trying to create space and kind of helping people just have a space to talk about that kind of thing, and how that's making them feel, and how that's affecting their day to day, right? Because this is something that they're seeing every day on their commute, which is, very difficult, and I think obviously adding a lot of stress and anxiety for people in a time that's already difficult.
Thanks for sharing that, Megan. As you were speaking, though, it made me think about something. We've talked a lot about like what organizations like NABC can do politically, with advocacy and things of that nature. Can you kind of explain like what we can do and what we cannot do as an organization?
Absolutely. So there are certain things that there in terms of groups and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. A lot of it has to do with their tax status, whether you be a 501c3, 4, or 6, right? And when you think about the different organizations and the tax statuses, that's also something that can be amended, and that's obviously something that we could talk about in the future. But being a 501c3 really only limits the amount of direct advocacy you can do with Congress or the executive branch. So, for example, if you're a 501c group, C3 group, and 90% of what you're doing is going to Congress, doing direct advocacy, that's going to be in conflict with your 501c3 status. However, if you're a 501c4 or C6, you can still have those nonprofit protections, but you are able to do things like endorse candidates, do scorecards for candidates. You could also do what we call toolkits, right? Where we create an advocacy toolkit to help provide education to members and tell them how to mobilize in their communities. All of these things are things that NABC can do today, but that's sort of the line that we would have to look at in terms of what we can do.
Awesome. That's really important because as an organization, we are taking a more robust social justice approach. And as I stated from the beginning when I made my first comment, a bit different from other organizations in that we're not just going to be providing CEs for people to continue to be licensed. We have an obligation not only to our members as counselors, but to our communities, because we are not only serving the community, we are members of the community. And these things not only impact us as counselors, but they impact us as human beings. And so we are taking an approach um, where we're trying to educate our members, but we're also trying to educate the community at large, and provide resources for them, because we're noticing that a lot of organizations that say that they stand with us and are for us and are allies and accomplices and et cetera, are not necessarily doing these things. So we truly appreciate that guidance. And it's good to know that even, once we've filed one status, like there are options to change and still remain protected as a nonprofit, but be able to do some more, things than we're currently able to do. So we appreciate that information. Uh,
Absolutely.
um, can you tell a little bit more about the relationship that NABC has with you all? Because we haven't really talked about that. Because that's
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm very excited that we've been recently engaged to work with NABC. As I mentioned, we talked a little bit about in the introduction, a lot of the work that I do is not only on the federal level, but at the state and local level. And we work with a number of groups like NABC that represents not only professionals, but also Black elected officials. And we help member organizations, one, define their political advocacy agenda, but also find ways to engage and mobilize that agenda, and directly assist by providing that guidance, but also walk hand in hand with you into those offices at every level to have conversations that are meaningful. And that, in terms of what that looks like in deliverables, that goes from everything from drafting content for you all to share with your members, putting together advocacy toolkits. And as I mentioned, those toolkits include information about elected officials, around the country, provides guidance and instructions on how to engage with those members of elected officials and members of Congress, and also provides draft letters and materials and content that you can use and edit to have those conversations, and also provides guidance on ways to work directly with some of the agencies as well. So sometimes that means having a direct meeting with HHS. Sometimes that means having meetings with members on both sides of the aisle in Congress on the committees that directly impact the purse strings of those organizations. And a lot of times that means also connecting you all with some of our other clients and also other groups in our network that helps leverage the messaging on issues where you all are aligned. So there's a number of ways that we are really excited about working with NABC. We definitely take the approach that we want to understand the vision and take the lead from the organization and really take that vision and bring it to life. So we are in early days, but I'm happy that I've had this opportunity this afternoon to connect with some of the membership, share some information. I think on some of the most basic part of this is really just voter engagement, and then talking soon, hopefully again, and addressing you all on putting together a policy agenda and bringing that to the table.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know that we have some work that we're getting ready to do with the Congressional Black Caucus and things of that nature coming up later on this month. And we'll be sharing with our membership the things that we're doing on that front in the coming weeks and days. It is going on 6 o'clock. I don't want to belabor the time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Angel, who is the head of our advocacy and social justice and policy committee for NABC. She doesn't have that in her name, but next time she will. And so she can take over the rest of the meeting. Thank you all.
All right, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Megan, for a great presentation and the way you explained a lot of the things. I did want to say that in the slide we were looking at with all the states and when they vote, I think Nick asked a question about how to learn more about the candidates that are running or that are candidates from other parties. That's also, you can find that in that link because it lists, excuse me, all of the candidates that are running for particular offices and roles in that particular state. So the link there, I'm sorry we aren't able to open that up for, this presentation, but it's very informative. So you may be able to find some of what you're looking for there. But Megan, we also look forward to receiving some of your additional resources. One of the things I wanted to ask before we close, the, we I wanted to put emphasis on the collective vote and just if you could kind of explain just what that means for us, the collective vote and the mission behind that.
Absolutely. So, the collective vote and just understanding what that means. I mean, I think that just really speaks to understanding that we want as many voices in our community to the table as possible. We never want our votes to be taken for granted. We never, either way, right? We don't want a particular party to assume that we're always going to vote with them, and we don't want people to assume that we're not going to be at the table and that we don't need to be a part of this process because we do. And I think that when I say that, that just doesn't mean, showing up on election day, but that does mean a lot of the organizing that needs to happen before we get there. Because not only is it important for us to show up, but it's also important that we are influencing the process and influencing the policy agendas of those who are being considered before they get our votes, but also on making sure that mutually we are making sure that the folks in our community are educated about the process and what the consequences of not participating are, as we talked about a lot.
Yeah, thank you. So before we close, we have a few more minutes. Are there any other questions or comments for for Megan? Okay, well, Megan, I look forward to working with you and continuing the work for NABC. And if there, Dr. Barner, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I did just want to thank Megan for her presentation. It was very informative, and I do look forward to working with you. Just one quick question, though. For someone who is, say, their political values align with, say, the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, and but I'm told that my vote really won't count because it's not one of the major parties. What would you say, especially to a young person who's interested in voting for those parties, but again, is being told that it really doesn't matter because it's not one of the major parties. And they've already concerned about their vote not counting anyway.
Absolutely. I think that, like I said before, I think that the dynamics of the system are designed to make people feel that way, and that's unfortunate. As I mentioned before, because of the way that the debate system is set up for the presidential, and also the way that the news media picks up on some of those candidates, a lot of the work that they're doing before we get to right to the election is not seen. However, when we think about what's happening in particular, I would say in the Democratic Party, and we're seeing some of these state and local elections, there are a lot of instances where there are folks are who are running or who are considering running or who are organizing that are not in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And I think a lot of times it would take, strategically, if I'm a young person and, I'm truly aligning and agreeing in the Libertarian Party, working directly with some of those candidates that are considering some of those smaller elections, because that is what is sort of what turns the head on a national level when you see, for example, someone in the Green or Libertarian Party come in and they primary someone in the Democratic or the Republican Party and they win, right? So sometimes, if you could even be in a small city, right? But if we see some of that action, if I was a young person that really wanted to see, a change in terms of this two-party structure, that is where you would start. That is where you would start to create the energy around making sure that those candidates are seriously considered when we get to a presidential, especially because, as I mentioned before, when it comes to the issues that actually impact our everyday lives, a lot of that is at the local level anyway. So if I was talking to a young person, that's the advice I would give them, and understand that, even though, there may not be a major political candidate for the Libertarian Party tomorrow, what happens on the ground and the collective action that happens at the grassroots is very important.
All right. Thank you, Megan.
Of course.
Well, Megan, is there anything you wanted to add before we close out?
I just wanted once again express gratitude for the opportunity to be here. As I mentioned before, I do a lot of this work with other groups, and I really truly love working with Black professional organizations, in particular, working with you all and the passion that you all have for advocacy in bringing us on to assist you with your vision. So I'm very excited to start this working relationship and to see NABC really make an impact in your communities.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I thank you, everyone who's attended. And if you weren't able to attend, and you pass this video on to those who weren't able to make it, able to attend today. We greatly appreciate it and look forward to seeing you again. We'll be doing more of these.
Thank you
Uh,
so much.
Thank you.